North Atlantic. Spring, 1944. A German U-boat drifts deep beneath a cold, heaving ocean. The steel hull trembles softly, as though aware of the danger rising above it. Inside, red emergency lamps cast long, wavering shadows across cramped passageways. Moisture beads on every surface. The air is thick, metallic, almost warm from the press of anxious bodies. A low hum of machinery fills the silence, steady, fragile, the only thing separating the crew from the crushing darkness outside. Somewhere in the control room, a faint tapping echoes through the hull. Not voices, not tools. The unmistakable pattern of a searching sonar beam sweeping across the submarine's metal skin. The men freeze. Sonar means contact. Contact means hunters. Then it comes, a distant thud, muffled by hundreds of feet of seawater. Another follows, then another. The first depth charges dropped in wide patterns, testing the ocean, feeling for a hidden shape. The lights flicker. Dust drifts from overhead pipes. The submarine tightens like a living thing bracing for impact. Above them, Allied destroyers circle, preparing for a bombardment that, on this day, will not end quickly. And with that first explosion, the world inside the U-boat begins to shrink, leading into the wider story of why these attacks grew so relentless. When the Second World War began in September 1939, the German Navy knew it could never match the size of the Royal Navy ship for ship. Surface vessels were too few, and capital ships too vulnerable. But submarines, small, hidden, and comparatively cheap to build, offered a different kind of power. In the eyes of German naval strategists, U-boats would become the long, patient reach of the Reich, stalking British shipping lanes and starving the United Kingdom of the fuel, food, and steel it needed to survive. The early phase of the conflict validated those ambitions. The Atlantic was vast, and in 1939 and 1940 the Allies still lacked the tools, coordination, and experience required to patrol it effectively. Many convoys sailed with minimal escort. Aircraft coverage was limited. Long-range radar barely existed. Submarines operating on the surface at night were exceptionally difficult to detect. A U-boat could rise from the black water, fire torpedoes at a merchant line, and disappear before most ships even realized they had been attacked. This era became known within the German Navy as a time of promise, precisely because it seemed as though stealth and surprise were entirely on their side. Crews learned the rhythm of the ocean, the language of the machinery, and the long, cold patience required to hunt in silence. They trained to use the hydrophone to track distant propellers and memorize the subtle ways a destroyer churned the sea compared to a tanker or freighter. Life aboard was difficult, but confidence was high. By 1940 and 1941, coordinated wolfpack tactics made U-boats even more effective. A single submarine might shadow a convoy from afar, transmitting contact reports back to command. Others would close in. When enough boats gathered, they launched a massed night attack, torpedoes streaking through dark water, the convoy twisting in confusion. The British Admiralty understood the threat, but lacked the escort numbers to respond effectively. Merchant ships burned, supply lines grew strained. Germany believed it had found the one naval tool capable of turning the island nation inward. Yet beneath these early successes, a slow shift had already begun. The Allies studied every loss. They added more escorts, improved their code breaking, and refined convoy discipline. Small changes at first, but each one chipped away at the U-boat's advantage. Still, inside the submarines, these developments were often invisible. Crews lived in cramped quarters where the nearest newspaper might be months old, and the only news came from the limited radio updates allowed during operations. They ate canned food, slept beside torpedoes, and worked in air that grew stale long before patrol was over. Fresh water was rationed. The smell of diesel lingered on every surface. And yet morale held, because they believed their work was decisive and their vulnerability masked by darkness and silence. The German Naval Command encouraged this optimism. Karl Donitz, head of the U-boat arm, emphasized endurance, discipline, and unity. He understood the psychological burden that underwater warfare imposed. A U-boat could not retreat easily. It could not outrun destroyers. Its strength came from invisibility. When that invisibility failed, the crew had no armor but depth, no shield but luck. Throughout 1941, Allied ships still struggled to find submerged submarines. Sonar existed, but early sets were limited by range and accuracy. Depth charges were often dropped by guesswork, and patterns were inconsistent. Many U-boats slipped away simply by diving deep, riding silently, and waiting for the enemy to give up the hunt. A typical attack might last a few minutes, perhaps half an hour. Prolonged hunts of several hours were rare. But the Battle of the Atlantic was dynamic, and every improvement on one side forced a response from the other. While Germany produced more submarines, the Allies invested heavily in detection. Out of sight, research laboratories across Britain and North America refined sensors, developed new explosives, and created better methods for coordinating escort groups. In doing so, they pushed the Atlantic War toward a new phase, one in which a U-boat under attack could no longer expect the enemy to abandon the chase quickly. This gradual escalation formed the backdrop against which the later, grueling depth-charge barges would unfold. The ocean that had once concealed U-boats so well was becoming a battlefield where technology, persistence, and coordination increasingly favored the hunters rather than the hunted. And as Allied capabilities expanded, German submariners began noticing the change, first in whispers, then in experience. Encounters growing longer, searches more precise, and the ocean itself beginning to feel hostile. It was within this evolving environment that the next stage emerged. By 1942, the balance in the Atlantic was shifting. What had once been a wide, underguarded ocean was gradually tightening around German submarines. The change did not happen in a single breakthrough. It happened through a chain of overlapping advancements, technological, tactical, and organizational, that slowly removed the U-boat's greatest protection: uncertainty. One of the earliest signs appeared on escort bridges across the North Atlantic. Radar, once unreliable in heavy seas, began improving dramatically. New cinemetric radar sets, using cavity magnetrons, could detect even a submarine's thin conning tower at night or in fog. A U-boat that surfaced to recharge batteries or ventilate the stale interior now risked being spotted miles away by a destroyer sweeping the horizon with a rotating antenna reflected in glowing oscilloscope lines. What had once been routine, surfacing under darkness, was becoming dangerous. Radio transmissions, too, grew perilous. The Allies expanded their use of HF/DF, known colloquially as Huff Duff. These high-frequency direction-finding stations, placed on escort ships and scattered across Britain and Allied bases abroad, could triangulate the source of German messages within minutes. Even short, encrypted bursts sent to coordinate wolf-pack attacks could betray a U-boat's general location. This forced commanders to choose between silence, which limited strategic coordination, or communication, which brought hunters closer. Aircraft intensified the pressure. Long-range patrol planes like the Consolidated B-24 Liberator closed the mid-Atlantic gap, once a safe zone beyond Allied air coverage. Equipped with radar, lee lights, and depth charges of their own, these aircraft pinned U-boats down or drove them deeper, forcing them to operate submerged longer and retreat from once favorable hunting grounds. A submarine caught on the surface by aircraft often had seconds, not minutes, to dive, and a too slow descent meant disaster. Meanwhile, escort groups matured. Rather than scatter defensive screens, They became highly trained, cohesive formations. British, Canadian, and American destroyers and corvettes learned to operate cooperatively, trading sonar contact without losing precision. A submarine evading one ship might surface into the path of another. A deep dive to avoid radar might invite sonar detection. In this environment, mistakes accumulated quickly. Sonar technology was undergoing rapid refinement as well. Early sets could lose contact during a depth charge attack, but newer models maintained the signal more consistently. Operators grew better at recognizing the acoustic signature of a submerged U-boat, even when it attempted to glide silently. What once required guesswork now approached systematic accuracy. Depth charges themselves evolved. Older models had limited fuse settings, creating wide but inefficient patterns. Newer versions allowed crews to preset detonations to exact depths, enabling more disciplined patterns based on sonar tracking. Escort ships deployed rails, throwers, and later K-guns that hurled charges outward to encircle a suspected submarine. A single ship could now produce a three-dimensional curtain of explosions that left little room for escape. Then came the Hedgehog. Unlike depth charges, these spigot-launched bombs did not explode unless they struck a hull. They allowed escorts to attack without losing sonar contact, an enormous tactical advantage. Although not every U-boat encounter involved Hedgehog attacks, the weapon forced German crews to adapt yet again, diving deeper or maneuvering more aggressively in unpredictable directions. All of this meant one thing. Once detected, a U-boat could no longer expect the hunt to end quickly. Allied ships stopped assuming a submarine would slip away. Instead, they circled, tightened their search pattern, and used overlapping sensors to keep the pressure constant. A hunt lasting hours became normal. In extreme cases, attacks stretched far longer, into the realm of an entire day or more. Submariners began noticing the psychological consequences. Crews who had trained for calculated maneuvers and measured silence were now subjected to long, punishing bombardments. They endured explosions that rattled teeth and cracked light bulbs, shockwaves that rolled through the steel pressure hull, and the growing dread of machinery failing under stress. The air would heat, thicken, and grow foul. Batteries drained. Carbon dioxide levels climbed. Every additional hour beneath the surface introduced new risks. By 1943, Germany's once feared U-boat arm was being forced into a defensive war. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Loss rates rose sharply, but even more striking was the change in how U-boats were lost. Fewer were destroyed quickly, and more were trapped, surrounded, and systematically hammered by depth charges until they either surfaced in surrender or descended into silence. This evolution set the stage for the long, harrowing encounters that would become infamous among German crews. Hours-long bombardments were no longer a rare ordeal. They were becoming a defining feature of the Battle of the Atlantic's final years. And from these brutal experiences emerged the many layers through which this story can be understood. Inside a submerged U-boat under attack, time distorts. Minutes stretch. The mechanical heartbeat of the diesel-electric systems becomes the only rhythm anchoring the crew to reality. In these conditions, the human experience becomes as central to survival as any piece of technology. Submariners were trained to endure discomfort, but nothing prepared them fully for the psychological extremity of prolonged depth charge hunts. When a barrage began, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Men held onto pipes and bulkheads as the hull shuddered with each distant thump. The air thickened quickly. Diesel residue, sweat, machine oil, and the stale breath of dozens of men sharing a confined space. Ventilation slowed. Every crew member controlled his breathing instinctively, knowing oxygen was limited and carbon dioxide would steadily rise. Fear was seldom spoken aloud. German naval culture valued composure, discipline, and silence. But fear manifested in quieter ways. Trembling hands, shallow breaths, the tight grip of fingers around a metal railing. Crewmen rotated through their stations, aware that any fatigue-induced mistake could produce noise detectable by sonar. Even shifting weight too heavily on the deck plates could betray their position. The greatest dread came not from the explosions themselves, but from what followed them. After each detonation, all ears strained to hear cracking, that ominous groan of metal under stress. A submarine hull could flex only so much. Every man aboard knew stories of boats crushed by pressure or torn apart by a near miss. This awareness created a deep, shared tension that consumed every minute of a long hunt. In those hours, survival depended as much on emotional stability as on engineering. And as Allied technology improved, these psychological trials became a defining element of the U-boat war. Below the waves and on the rolling decks of Allied destroyers, a tactical duel unfolded, one shaped by precision, instinct, and relentless discipline. A submarine commander's best defense was unpredictability. Once detected, survival depended on breaking the enemy's pattern long enough to slip away into deeper, darker water. But as the war progressed, this escape became increasingly difficult. German captains employed a range of maneuvers. They might execute a sharp dive, descending quickly to depths where sonar struggled to track them. They could cut the engines, allowing the boat to drift silently while listening for approaching ships. Or they might attempt the corkscrew, a spiraling descent designed to confuse sonar operators. These tactics had worked in earlier years, but by 1943 the Allies were prepared. Escort groups coordinated their movements with increasing sophistication. A destroyer holding sonar contact would radio its course and speed to nearby ships, allowing them to fan out and form a tightening ring. Each ship timed its turns to avoid leaving gaps. While one vessel attacked with depth charges, another moved in to reacquire the submarine immediately afterward. This coordination prevented U-boats from slipping between escorts or hiding behind the turbulence of an explosion. Prolonged hunts emerged from this tactical rigor. The initial contact no longer signaled a brief skirmish. It signaled a systematic, sustained operation. Allies understood that patience was a weapon. A submarine forced to stay submerged long enough would eventually run low on battery power, air quality, and options. This interplay, German evasion versus Allied persistence, lay at the heart of the long bombardments that defined the later war. Technology shaped every second of a depth charge hunt. On one side of the ocean's surface, destroyer crews relied on electronics, mechanics, and mathematics to convert sound into spatial awareness. On the other side, submerged sailors trusted in steel thickness, dive capabilities, and the fragile reliability of batteries and pumps. Allied sonar systems, originally prone to losing contact during attacks, improved significantly by late 1942. Operators learned to interpret subtle echoes, the shape of a returning ping, the delay, the tonal shift caused by underwater currents. A submarine's attempt to glide silently could still betray itself through faint hull reflections. Where early sonar might give a vague bearing, later systems delivered positions clear enough for precise attack runs. Depth charges themselves reflected equal advancement. Their casings housed formidable explosives, TNT, Amitol, or Torpex, capable of damaging a submarine without striking it directly. Detonators could be set to explode at preset depths, allowing a destroyer to layer charges at multiple levels. K-guns and throwers expanded the attack radius, letting ships produce wide, overlapping patterns. These changes created what engineers called explosive geometry, a three-dimensional web of pressure waves designed to trap a submarine and collapse its maneuvering space. The U-boat's instruments shook violently, bolts loosened, glass shattered, and even near misses could compromise ballast tanks or electrical panels. The technological race meant that by 1943, long bombardments were not accidents. They were the calculated result of refined equipment working in concert, hour after hour. Inside a U-boat under attack, the commander's role became a test of nerve unlike anything on land or aboard surface ships. A captain could not pace, could not raise his voice, could not be seen to panic. Every order had to be measured, calm, and deliberate. The crew watched him constantly, not out of distrust, but because his composure set the emotional temperature of the entire boat. German U-boat commanders were trained to act with independence. Once submerged, they could not wait for guidance from shore. Every decision had to account for sonar sweeps, battery levels, ballast integrity, and the mental endurance of the men. In a long hunt, leadership became a balancing act between aggression and patience. Diving too deep might strain the hull. Surfacing too early risked radar detection. Moving noisily could betray their position. Yet remaining still for too long allowed oxygen to run dangerously low. Many commanders developed personal methods to remain steady. Some focused intently on the hydrophone readings, analyzing propeller rhythms to anticipate attack runs. Others relied on instinct built from years underwater, calculating evasive turns based on the cadence of sonar pings. But beneath the calm exterior, the weight of responsibility was immense. Every explosion reverberating through the hull felt like a judgment on their decisions. And in battles that lasted hours, German captains had to maintain clarity while enduring the same suffocating air, the same tremors of fear, and the same fatigue that pressed on their crews. Leadership, in these moments, became the fragile thread linking survival to cohesion. Without it, even the strongest hull could not protect the boat from panic. To understand the full scope of hours-long depth charge attacks, one must also examine the experience from the Allied side of the battle. Destroyer crews, corvette captains, and aircraft teams were not randomly dropping explosives. Their hunts were deliberate, organized, and rooted in an evolving doctrine of anti-submarine warfare. For Allied sailors, maintaining sonar contact was both a technical and mental challenge. Standing for hours on rolling decks, operators listened to the rhythmic pulse of their equipment. When they detected a faint echo returning from below, a chain of actions followed instantly. Helm orders to adjust course, speed changes to maintain the right angle for sonar clarity, and radio updates to nearby escorts. A prolonged hunt required endurance. Crews rotated through stations. Meals were eaten hastily, and sleep became a luxury. Destroyer engines roared continuously, driving the vessel through sharp turns meant to box in the submarine. Depth charges were loaded, primed, and rolled off rails in carefully timed sequences. The noise, vibration, and smoke of these attacks consumed every corner of the ship. From the Allied viewpoint, the purpose of a long hunt was simple: deny the U-boat any window of escape. Tracking a submarine for 10 minutes was an accomplishment. Tracking one for 2 hours was mastery. Monitoring one for 8, 12, or even 20 hours was a demonstration of the technological and tactical leap the Allies had achieved by mid-war. For the destroyer crews, this was not cruelty, it was necessity. Merchant convoys carried the lifeline of the Allied war effort. A single missed submarine could cost thousands of tons of shipping. Thus, persistence became a strategic imperative. Long depth charge hunts in the Atlantic were not simply tactical episodes. They reflected the broader moral and strategic logic of a world war fought across oceans. Submarine warfare had always existed in a gray zone of ethics. U-boats targeted merchant ships to weaken the enemy's economy. Allied escorts responded with overwhelming force to protect those same lifelines. Each side viewed its actions as necessary, even justified, within the wider struggle. For Germany, U-boats offered the only path to challenge British maritime dominance. The crews who went to sea understood the risks. They operated without illusions. Every patrol might be their last. By 1943, loss rates were so high that joining the U-boat arm meant facing the deadliest assignment in the German military. Yet volunteers still came, driven by duty, belief, or the desire to serve in a branch renowned for toughness and discipline. For the Allies, the moral calculation was equally stark. If convoys failed, Britain starved. Factories closed. War production faltered. Thus, the intensity of anti-submarine warfare was not aimed at individual sailors. It was aimed at preserving nations. Destroyer crews viewed prolonged hunts as grim but essential work, a shield raised against an unseen threat. The result was a battle where survival depended on endurance, psychological, mechanical, and moral. No side saw these long hunts as personal. They were the inevitable convergence of competing necessities, played out in an unforgiving ocean where neither technology nor courage alone could guarantee survival. These intertwined angles formed the world in which the war beneath the Atlantic unfolded, setting the stage for the decisive moments when everything would converge into a single turning point. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Atlantic War had evolved into something German submariners of the early campaigns could scarcely have imagined. Encounters once measured in minutes could now stretch into the long, grinding hours that tested every limit of man and machine. Among these, several hunts would enter U-boat memory as defining examples of how dramatically the war had shifted and how ferociously the Allies pursued their underwater enemies. The decisive turning point unfolded not in one single event, but in a pattern repeated across multiple U-boats caught in the tightening grip of Allied hunter-killer groups. One such pattern began with a seemingly ordinary contact. The moment a destroyer's sonar operator detected an echo, sharp, rhythmic, unmistakable, returning from a submerged steel hull. Once that signal appeared, the fate of the U-boat hung on a razor's edge. What followed mirrored many of the prolonged chases recorded during 1944. A submarine, detected at periscope depth while attempting to shadow a convoy, immediately ordered a crash dive. The klaxons sounded, the bow angled downward, and seawater poured over the decks as the boat plunged beneath the waves. Within minutes, it slipped into the dim green twilight below 100 meters. But the destroyer had already committed. Sonar contact remained firm. The U-boat leveled out deeper, aiming for the cold, darker layers of the ocean. The commander ordered silence. Non-essential equipment was shut down. Men froze in place. Even the clink of a tool against steel could betray them. Then came a first attack run. A destroyer charged directly above, engines roaring through the hydrophones like thunder underwater. The submarine shook violently as the first pattern of depth charges detonated nearby. The pressure waves slammed into the hull with physical force. Lights flickered, gauges quivered, and a rain of dust drifted down from overhead pipes. Hoping the pattern was imprecise, the commander angled the boat into a slow turn, trying to slip away. But the destroyer regained contact almost immediately. This was no longer the uncertain sonar of 1940. Allied operators now adjusted their settings, compensated for thermal layers, and followed the submarine's movement with practiced discipline. The second depth charge pattern came quickly. It fell tighter, more focused. The explosions marched across the ocean like a rolling wall of thunder. Inside the U-boat, the hull groaned as if bending under immense strain. A few light bulbs shattered. A valve in the aft compartment began to leak. The chief engineer rushed to tighten it with trembling hands. The crew said nothing. They had learned that silence was the only defense. Above them, more ships had joined the chase. At least 2 destroyers and a corvette maneuvered into a triangular formation. Each vessel took turns attacking, maintaining constant pressure. While one delivered a depth charge run, another prepared to reacquire sonar contact the moment the blast subsided. The third ship closed gaps in the pattern, ready to drop charges from K-guns, rails, and throwers. Minutes turned into an hour. 1 hour became 2. Battery levels began to fall. Carbon dioxide levels rose. The air warmed, thickened, became heavy on the tongue. Men wiped sweat from their foreheads despite the cold steel around them. The commander monitored his gauges closely, pressure, depth, battery strength, knowing that each passing minute narrowed their options. By the third hour, the U-boat attempted a desperate maneuver. The commander ordered a slow ascent to shift depth layers, hoping the temperature differential would distort sonar readings. The boat rose a few meters, then leveled off. But the destroyers adjusted immediately. Their coordinated turning circle tightened. The sonar pings grew louder, sharper, closer. Another barrage followed. These charges detonated with such force that several crewmen lost their footing. A pipe burst in the forward compartment, spraying a fine mist of seawater. The submarine tilted slightly as ballast tanks compensated. The engineer reported rising humidity and oxygen depletion. A battery cell showed signs of damage, dangerous in an enclosed space where fumes could ignite. Still, the U-boat held together. The commander kept his voice calm, issuing quiet instructions. Ventilation stayed minimal. Pumps ran sparingly to avoid noise. The hydrophone operator listened intently for any break in the destroyer's rhythm, any sign the hunters were drifting off course or losing concentration. But the enemy's pattern remained unbroken. By the fourth hour, the crew realized this was no ordinary evasive battle. This was a sustained hunt, the kind the Allies had refined through bitter experience. Destroyers maintained their formation with precision, rotating their attack roles without pause. A new sound then reverberated through the hull, a series of rapid, metallic splashes from above. The men recognized it instantly. Hedgehog projectiles. These smaller bombs would only explode on impact with the hull, meaning silence after launch was not a relief, it was terror. The crew held their breath, waiting for a detonation that might signal catastrophic damage. Seconds passed. Nothing struck, but the pressure was unrelenting. The commander angled the boat deeper, pushing the hull toward its operational limits. The steel creaked ominously as depth increased. Beyond this point, the margin for error disappeared. Now nearly 5 hours into the hunt, the U-boat hovered at a depth that left no room for further descent. The commander knew that one more accurate pattern could rupture pipelines, crush bulkheads, or disable the battery system entirely. Yet surrender was impossible. Surfacing meant facing artillery, machine guns, and boarding crews. Remaining submerged meant hoping for a mistake from above. The climax of these long battles came when the submarine's endurance, its air, depth limits, and crew discipline, met the destroyer's stamina and precision. And as the next phase of the assault began, the final test of survival was about to decide everything. The sea was supposed to silence everything. But on this night, in these hunting grounds stretching from Iceland's gray horizon to the shores of occupied France, it became a stage of relentless violence. For you, 427, you, 744, and dozens of other German submarines trapped in the tightening noose of Allied anti-submarine power. The final act of every depth-charge chase came down to one terrifying truth, outlasting the next explosion. When the pattern began again, distant propellers rising, fading, then rising once more, the hydrophone operators felt it before they heard it. A faint tremor in the hull, a metallic hum, then the unmistakable rhythm. They're turning toward us. The captain responded without hesitation. Below negative. Bring her to 90 meters. Silent running, everything. But the Allies had mastered a deadly art. Destroyer escorts no longer searched blindly. They attacked in organized, rehearsed cycles. Sonar sweep, hold contact, estimate depth, launch hedgehog, or depth charge pattern, circle around attack again. And every cycle came closer than the last. Inside the U-boat, the men were running out of reserves, oxygen, battery power, and eventually hope. Every hour submerged meant more carbon dioxide pooling in the compartments, turning the air sour, thick, hot. Sweat rolled down faces already streaked with oil. Every man breathed shallowly to conserve what little remained. The depth charges resumed, a rolling thunder of detonations. Some bursts far enough away to rattle. Some close enough to hammer the hull like a fist, shaking lights and knocking men off their feet. A pipesman screamed as a valve ruptured above him, sending boiling water across the deck. The chief engineer killed the steam line with a burning wrench. Two crewmen dragged the injured man into the bunk space, where he lay trembling, choking out the same question so many had asked that year. Why won't they stop? For the destroyer crews above, the question was the opposite. Why won't she break? Hours passed. Entire shifts rotated. Some Allied sailors ate breakfast while their ship was still dropping explosives. Others drank coffee between runs. There is no record of any single destroyer crew remarking on the strangeness of it, but offhand comments survive, carried through war diaries and patrol logs. Boats like this don't die easy. He's deep, but he's still down there. Something's keeping him alive. What kept the U-boats alive, however, was rarely luck. It was the cold engineering of desperation. Trim adjustments measured in centimeters. Crawling descent to escape sonar beams. Finding underwater layers where temperature distorted signals. Sacrificing silence when forced to maneuver. Praying the batteries would last one more hour. On some boats, bilge pumps ran constantly to counter flooding. On others, men bailed with buckets. In one U-boat report, crew used wool blankets to slow a leak, holding fabric in place with their bare bodies as the depth charging continued. Still, the hunt pressed on. Destroyer escorts coordinated attacks with aircraft. Hedgehog launchers fired dozens of contact-fused bombs in tight clusters, exploding only when they struck metal. The shockwaves of near misses twisted internal piping, cracked gauges, and shattered light bulbs across compartments. The climax became a duel of endurance. The Allies had fuel, sonar, manpower. The U-boats had the pressure hull and the will of the men breathing inside it. And somewhere between those two forces lay the question that defined every hunter-killer operation of the North Atlantic. Would the submarine surface, or would it simply vanish? For you, 744, the answer finally came after 30 continuous hours of bombardment. The boat could dive no deeper. Her batteries were moments away from collapse. Her crew was breathing carbon dioxide-rich air that left them hallucinating and staggering. When the order was given to surface, it was not triumph or defiance. It was surrender to physics. The destroyers waiting above opened fire instantly, raking the conning tower with shell bursts as the crew fled overboard. The U-boat slipped beneath the surface one last time, not as a fighting vessel, but as a wreck. Others survived. You, 427 staggered back into port after over 200 depth charges, its hull dented, systems wrecked, its crew moving like men who had glimpsed the bottom of the sea. U-569 did not survive intact. The crew scuttled her after being battered beyond recovery. Scores of other boats vanished entirely, swallowed without witnesses. But whether destroyed, surrendered, or escaped, every U-boat shared the same revelation in these final hours of bombardment. The age of the submarine hunter had come. And the ocean, once the sanctuary of the silent predators, was no longer theirs. And as the surviving submariners gasped the first breath of clean air or climbed into captivity, the next chapter began quietly, shaped by wreckage, exhaustion, and the shifting tide of naval strategy. A chapter defined not by the explosions themselves, but by what came after they finally stopped. The final moments of a prolonged depth-charge attack left indelible marks, not only on the submarine hulls and mechanical systems, but on the men who had endured them. For those who survived, the relief of surfacing or rescue was tempered by exhaustion, trauma, and the vivid memory of hours spent trapped in a steel tube beneath relentless explosions. The human cost was immediate and palpable. Crewmen suffered from injuries caused by flying debris, ruptured pipes, or concussive shock waves. Others experienced temporary or permanent hearing loss. Nearly all carried the psychological weight of confinement and fear for the remainder of their lives. In the wider Atlantic theater, these engagements sent ripples through the operational calculus of both sides. The Allies, through meticulous reports and post-battle analysis, confirmed that coordinated hunter-killer groups, destroyers working alongside corvettes and aircraft, were capable of sustaining pressure over extended periods. Operational logs from March to May 1944 demonstrate multiple U-boats being tracked for 10 hours or more, with destroyers cycling through attack patterns to maintain constant sonar contact. The resulting attrition forced the German Kriegsmarine to acknowledge a stark reality. The Atlantic was no longer a forgiving hunting ground. Tonnage loss statistics reflect the tactical effectiveness of these prolonged engagements. In the first half of 1944, German U-boat losses rose sharply. For example, in March alone, 35 submarines were sunk, several following multi-hour engagements documented in Allied action reports. While some crews survived and returned to port, many more did not, contributing to the highest mortality rate of any branch in the German armed forces. Commanders like Karl Donitz faced the sobering realization that each new patrol carried increasingly improbable odds of survival. The material destruction extended beyond the human toll. Surviving submarines required extensive repairs, often rendering them out of action for months. Pressure hulls, ballast systems, propulsion units, and electrical circuits all suffered cumulative stress from sustained detonations, with some components weakening in ways that could compromise future patrols. A submarine might survive one extended hunt, but its structural integrity was forever altered, effectively reducing its combat lifespan. At the strategic level, these engagements shifted the dynamics of the Battle of the Atlantic. Allies gained confidence in their ability to control shipping lanes and protect convoys, while Germany's U-boat fleet increasingly adopted defensive postures. Wolf-pack tactics, once the backbone of German naval strategy, lost some of their efficacy against coordinated, persistent hunter-killer groups. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was as significant as the tactical consequences. Fear and anticipation of extended depth-charge attacks eroded morale, contributing to higher rates of stress-induced errors and a growing reluctance among commanders to engage aggressively. Documentation from captured crews and post-war interviews highlights this change vividly. Sailors recounted the terror of being bombarded for hours, the sensation of the hull flexing under pressure, and the eerie silence between attacks that seemed to stretch endlessly. Reports describe men calculating oxygen levels, estimating battery endurance, and silently praying for the briefest miscalculation by their attackers. Even for those who returned to port, these experiences reshaped the perception of submarine warfare, replacing confidence with caution and daring with survival instinct. The first section of Aftermath, therefore, establishes both the tangible and intangible consequences of long-duration depth charge attacks, human suffering, material damage, and a profound strategic shift. The ocean that had once concealed submarines had transformed into a lethal arena where technology, persistence, and coordination determined life or death. These lessons would ripple forward, influencing not only the remainder of the Atlantic campaign, but the future design of submarines, depth charge technology, and anti-submarine doctrine. The final consequences, however, extended beyond individual patrols and isolated encounters. They reshaped the entire strategic and psychological landscape of a U-boat war. As the Battle of the Atlantic pressed on through 1944, the cumulative effect of hours-long depth charge engagements became unmistakable. Allied control over shipping lanes strengthened, and the Kriegsmarine faced a harsh calculus. Every additional patrol carried the weight of potentially catastrophic losses. U-boat crews, once confident in their ability to stalk convoys unseen, now confronted the reality of relentless, technologically sophisticated hunters capable of maintaining pressure for half a day or more. The psychological impact was profound, reshaping behavior and decision-making at every level. Strategically, the Allies had gained the upper hand. Escort groups, coordinated destroyers, corvettes, and long-range aircraft exerted near-constant surveillance over convoys, using radar, sonar, and HF/DF triangulation to predict submarine movements. Hunter-killer groups were no longer rare. They became standard procedure. U-boats that attempted to shadow a convoy risked multi-hour bombardments designed to exhaust both the vessel and its crew. Lost statistics from mid-1943 through 1944 illustrate the effect. The average U-boat's survival rate dropped dramatically once detected, with attrition increasingly linked to sustained hunts rather than quick engagements. Submarine warfare had shifted from opportunistic strikes to a war of endurance, and the Allies held the advantage. German naval leadership recognized the new strategic reality, but options were limited. Surface escort vessels, advanced sonar, and aircraft were difficult to counter effectively. While some U-boats survived extreme depth charge attacks, such as U-427, which endured over 200 explosive impacts, the operational strain was immense. Prolonged hunts caused mechanical fatigue, electrical system failures, and structural compromises that required extensive repairs upon return. Each patrol risked leaving the submarine weakened, further reducing Germany's offensive capabilities. The psychological toll cannot be overstated. Interviews with surviving U-boat crew members reveal that the fear of extended bombardment influenced every tactical choice. Commanders hesitated to engage convoys aggressively. Some opted for defensive maneuvers over offensive action, knowing that detection could trigger hours of relentless punishment. Morale declined steadily, and new volunteers, while still entering service, faced grim statistics and stories of near-impossible survival. Survival was no longer an expectation. It was an extraordinary achievement. This combination of strategic pressure, technological superiority, and psychological strain contributed decisively to the Allies' eventual dominance in the Atlantic. The ability to maintain sustained depth charge operations not only neutralized individual U-boats, but also eroded the broader operational effectiveness of the Kriegsmarine. By the latter half of 1944, Germany's submarine campaign was no longer a potent offensive tool. It had become a costly defensive struggle against forces that could track, attack, and exhaust submarines over hours of continuous engagement. Ultimately, the prolonged depth charge hunts demonstrated a shift in naval warfare. Success depended not only on individual skill or courage, but on endurance, coordination, and technological advantage. The ocean, once a refuge, had become a crucible where every factor, man, machine, and strategy, was tested to its absolute limit. And from the survivor's perspective, each emerging from the wreckage of hours-long bombardment carried a stark reminder. In this new era, endurance was survival, and survival itself had become a rare and costly victory. The stage was now set for reflection. What did these long, punishing engagements reveal about humanity, warfare, and the inexorable march of technology? The prolonged, depth-charge hunts of the Atlantic were more than episodes of naval combat. They were a crucible in which the limits of human endurance, engineering, and strategy were laid bare. For the submariners trapped beneath miles of seawater, every second stretched into a test of nerve and discipline. The hum of machinery, the creak of metal, and the relentless thuds of explosives became the rhythm of their world, a world where survival demanded absolute composure. Hours of bombardment stripped away illusion and left only stark reality. Life aboard a submarine was measured in pressure, in air, in the precise management of every resource, and above all, in courage. For the Allies, the effectiveness of sustained anti-submarine tactics illustrated the convergence of technology and coordination. Sonar, radar, depth charges, and the disciplined orchestration of multiple vessels and aircraft transformed hunting into a science. The ocean, once a sanctuary for the silent predators of the Kriegsmarine, became a theater in which persistence and precision dictated the outcome. These operations reshaped naval doctrine and demonstrated that modern warfare was not merely a contest of firepower, but of endurance, calculation, and adaptation. The human dimension remained central. For every U-boat that survived, the crew emerged changed, marked physically by the strain on the body and psychologically by the tension of hours under assault. For those who did not, the ocean became a grave, a silent testament to the peril inherent in submarine service. In parallel, Allied crews learned the value of persistence, coordination, and patience, understanding that victory could be measured not only in tonnage sunk or enemies destroyed, but in hours spent maintaining unrelenting pressure against an elusive foe. Ultimately, these long hunts underscore a profound truth about warfare. Survival is rarely guaranteed, and advantage lies with those who can endure longer, calculate better, and act with disciplined patience. They reveal the duality of human conflict, the simultaneous capacity for innovation and cruelty, courage and suffering. In the Atlantic, beneath steel hulls and rolling waves, history was made in minutes, in hours, and in the quiet persistence of men facing forces far greater than themselves. The echoes of those depth-charge barges reverberate far beyond their time, reminding us that the ocean, technology, and human resolve together shaped one of the most intense chapters of naval warfare in history.